welcome back to making great D&D, because D&D can be made great with a little effort and a bit of input from great humans like us, like Chris and Wang. Hello, Wen, it's the first time you're here.
Hi.
Super excited to have you around because you are the first guest that we have in the show.
What an honor. Thank you.
Well, we couldn't expect for anyone better, really. So I'm super excited. So, hi, Chris. Sorry, mate. I forgot you were there. I was focusing on the important people.
Yeah, I'm just secondary. It's true.
Well, you've been here before. I already know you.
Yeah,
So come on, you're not exciting anymore. You're just old school.
No, I'm old hat.
Exactly. So anyway, how are you, Wayne? How are you doing?
Me? I'm fine. How are you?
Wow, that was succinct. See, Wayne, what I have to be dealing with all the time.
It must be tough.
I know. Imagine being married to him. God.
I wouldn't want to be.
No, me neither. Also, my husband will have something to say about that. So, and how are you, Wayne? How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It's a beautiful day, and I'm enjoying my weekend.
Good. Well, let's make sure that it continues being enjoyable and that we talk about some amazing stuff regarding Dungeons and Dragons. But first and foremost, even though both Chris and I are very much aware of your wholesomeness and amazing kudos and personality and everything wonderful about you, but there might be some humans out there who don't have the privilege. So tell us a little bit about you.
Okay. My name is Gwen Marshall. My pronouns are she, her. I am a game designer and I'm a college professor also. I teach philosophy, but I am a transgender woman living in Middle America. I could go on about. I wrote a book called Ancestry and Culture, an alternative to race in 5e that won some Emmy awards and got some attention. And I've been doing freelance work, and I work for 2C Gaming currently now as their game designers.
Wow. So that means like it's like if you were perfect for this episode. Who knew?
Coincidence? I think that's new. Yeah.
Okay, because we're going to talk about, and this is a very hot topic, very up for debate in brackets, because not everybody, let's face it, understands exactly what is culture, what is ancestry, and why it is so important to make it, to build it correctly when we do world building. And as a disclaimer, I will say that probably out of the three here, I am the one who knows the least about this topic. So I am going to be more the one kind of moderating and asking questions, mostly to stop myself from saying something stupid, which I am very adept at. So let's start.
We'll tell you.
Sorry?
We'll tell you.
Oh, I'm bloody hope so. Come on, everybody will tell me, I hope. So, okay, so let's do this a bit more methodically. What I would like you to both do is to give me a little bit of your, 2-3 minutes of your ideas as to what is your approach as creators to building cultures and ancestries. Now, the thing is, and I'm going to ask Chris first for one reason, and it's because if I let you go first, then Chris will know all the answers. And we'll have it a lot easier because
I'll just say I agree.
You're the expert.
Okay. Yeah, that assumes I have answers, but okay, I'll go with it.
Oh, no. I assume I know. You don't have answers. You have knowledge, which is probably better.
See what I can do.
So, okay, Chris.
I call foul.
Okay, wait.
No. Go ahead.
No, seriously. As a you've been creating D&D since 1870 or thereabouts. Mm-hmm. What has been your approach for building Ancestries and Cultures, and how has it changed since you started until now? What's the difference for you between building Ancestries and Cultures when you started and when if you have to create a new one right now?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by started. So started playing D&D when I was 10 years old, which was 40 years ago.
Okay.
And I think that culturally in the game then, there was a lot of stuff that seemed like it was the right thing to do. Also, it was just brand new, so nobody really knew what they were doing. They were just making it up as they went along. And there's a lot of things that I probably would have thought was right then, or that aren't I wouldn't now, like racial ability score adjustments.
Oh,
Um, and there's a lot you could say about that because it is rooted in your bloodline determines your attributes, which is already going off the rails really hard. Like, um, and but there's a legacy thing. So having played the game so long, there's this legacy thing where people just think it's the right thing to do because it's been done for so long, and that's just not true. And I would say that it's not true from a cultural perspective, and it's not true from a game design perspective.
okay.
But since we're talking about game design, game more than culture, and I know probably more about games than I do about culture in general. uh, the I would say that the racial ability score adjustment thing is somewhat of a red herring. That's because from a game design perspective, they don't those ability score adjustments don't belong in ancestries at all.
Okay.
And and from a game design perspective, what I mean by that is that it's actually harder to learn to play the game and to make a character if you have to look at an ability score adjustment in a species that you want to play. You say, "Oh, I want to be an elf, but I want to be a fighter, and elves don't get a bonus to strength. Oh, and they get a penalty to Constitution. Oh, hmm." So I don't think that you should have to jump through those hoops. I think you should be able to make the character that you want to make. And so to if I was the king of D&D and I could just wave a magic wand and change something today, I would eliminate racial ability adjustments altogether. They wouldn't exist anywhere.
Okay.
And ability adjustments wouldn't exist anywhere. They would be compartmentalized in determining your ability scores. You would just determine your ability scores, and that would be it. Now, if you would be taught how to do that to get the character that you want to get. So there would be a lot of rearranging to do. But so what would I do today? One of the major things that I would do today is I would eliminate racial ability score adjustments, and I would do some division on what is the supernatural abilities that you have because of your species and what things you learn because of how your character grew up.
Okay.
So your background and the culture you came from and all of those things would help you as a player determine the capabilities that your character had, with the caveat that I want you to be able to create the character that you want to play all the way across the board. I don't want you to have to jump through hoops. Like I have to mitigate this constitution penalty that I'm getting from this element of character creation. You shouldn't have to mitigate anything when you're creating a character. You should end up with the character that you want.
Okay. Sounds like a good answer to me. Gwen, how about you? How has it changed for you starting, your creation of Ancestries and Culture as it is now? What's been your evolution?
Well, I mean, in a way, like Chris, I started playing when I was 9 or 10, and yeah, I just thought, well, these are just fantasy tropes. It's just like I read Tolkien, and Uruk are like this, and elves are like that, and so that's what it's like in my D&D. But of course, that's super problematic. I now know, and that so when I wrote Ancestry and Culture 2.5 years ago. Um, I tried to fix some of those issues that other people had drawn my attention to, mostly players in the community of color who it made uncomfortable. And but I also tried to make it compatible with D&D as it existed at the time. So I took the racial ability bonuses and took them out of Ancestry and put them into Culture, which is, but I honestly do prefer just not having it in either, and
Mhm.
just making your ability scores the way you want it to. And I'll give Wizards credit; they did, that's what it sort of is like now for the most part. Although in the one D&D things are different a little bit, but Tasha's Cauldron of Everything gives you the option to just put your bonuses where you want it, no matter what your race choice is. But of course, like Chris suggested, yes, there's still the matter of going through and looking at the different features and properties that traits you get from choosing your race, and realizing that, like, okay, I get that, like, okay, an elf might have dark vision because they have elven parents, and a dwarf might have a certain lifespan because they have dwarven parents. But why does having a dwarven parent make you good at smithing, or knowing how to navigate stonework, or knowing how to shoot an elven longbow? I mean, people aren't born with that normally, so that's weird. Those should go in culture, background, education, right? And so that part of what I did in the original book, I would, I stand by that. And but I do actually think that doing away with the ability score bonuses completely would be ideal. It just, at the time before Tasha's, that was not compatible with D&D, and I had two design goals. One was to address the essentialism of race, and the other was to make it compatible with D&D out of the box. So that's how I did it then, and how I do it a little differently now, I think.
Okay, I have a question because the first thing I was thinking when you were mentioning about doing away with that kind of ability scores is, so how would you be able to reflect that a species in particular can have a vulnerability? For example, let's say that the Aarakocra are avian, and you want to make them, because they're avian, birds can have hollow bones, so they are lighter, so they can fly. Let's say that we want to reflect that they do have a bone structure which is indeed more fragile than that of a dwarf or an elf or an orc or pretty much another creature. How would you, in that case, as a designer, go and reflect that in a way that it makes sense for the species, but it doesn't become a hindrance, or it doesn't become bioessentialist in a negative way? How do you do that?
Um, is that question directed to me?
To whoever raises the hand first. You've raised your hand there, so yes, when.
Okay. Two things. One, I think that magical properties that aren't reflective of generalized ability, and don't map onto anything that we normally think of as humans having in our world, like the ability to see in the dark or something, is less problematic to ascribe to an ancestry. So, like, Tritons can still have gills, and Aarakocra can still have wings, and we can say they have those because of their birth. And no one's going to be. That's not going to make a player uncomfortable that their bird character has wings, right? That's
That's
kind of
just the way they are.
standard, right? But if you, but if you say, well, they have a minus to strength or hit points or constitution or something, then you might think, oh, well, that's kind of a bummer. Still probably isn't going to make them feel like this is emulating some sort of racist thing, which it might if the primal savage orc, because I mean they used to have a trait called savage attacks, and then, oh yes, they are also not as smart. That's way problematic stuff. So you might think, well, whatever, just give them the minus, and it's not going to be problematically racist. But it is, like Chris said, less fun, and
Mm.
it hinders your choices of class, right? So I think what I would like to do as a designer is I try to acknowledge that limitation. And actually, Wizards does an okay job with Aarakocra on this because they can't fly in heavy armor,
Okay.
right? So that's a limitation that is in the rules, but it isn't a strength minus. And so what we have to do as designers is try to represent the features of the race or ancestry or culture that we want, perhaps with some, mind or eye on realistic, but never let what's realistic get in the way of a good play experience. I mean, we are playing a game with dragons in it, so we're already giving up on verisimilitude here.
Mhm.
This is not a simulationist game. It's okay if that's not really realistic. So, for example, it's true that in our world birds have hollow bones, but our Kokra are magical beings. I don't know if they have hollow bones. I don't
Okay.
know if that's officially in the rules. And why can't they have 20 strength and be a fighter? Why
Mhm.
not? Right? Is it really that much harder to believe that that's possible than that there's dragons? So I find realism to be something that's only fun for immersion and like sake and to make the world a little coherent
Mhm.
up to the point, but never going beyond the point where it impedes the fun of the play or the narrative and the creativeness we get to have when we create our characters.
Okay. Christopher, how are you?
I think another way you can approach that is to offer guidance rather than rules.
Mm.
So you could have a paragraph in a species that says that something like Aarakocra have hollow bones. That could give you a reason to assign your lowest score to Constitution. But you as the player make that choice, right? So I'm going to say, okay, well, that's kind of cool. Maybe I want my Aarakocra in this game to be a little bit fragile. So I will do that. I will assign. But as my choice of how I want to play this character, I will assign the lowest score that I have to Constitution. And I'll have fewer hit points because of that and stuff like that. But that's the way I want to play the character. And the guidance is not enforcing anything. The
Mhm.
guidance is just telling you that, and I think that such guidance should also be very blatantly honest about being stereotypical. Like we're talking about stereotype. We're talking about a stereotype, Aarakocra. We're not talking about your 20 strength, 16 constitution, paladin Aarakocra. We're talking about averages
Mm.
and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, as long as I wouldn't want to put um the problematic stuff even in guidance, which you weren't suggesting, I know, but that would just be one qualification I'd add. Otherwise,
Yeah,
yeah, actually that's a great idea.
for sure.
Like I wouldn't want to say typically, orcs are ignorant and violent. Like, oh, well, let's just not use that sort of way of talking about savage people at all.
Yeah. Well, that goes to world building too. Like,
Mm.
world building is always a choice. So, if something exists in Game of Thrones, or something exists in Lord of the Rings, or something like this recent The Rings of Power TV show,
Mhm.
if something exists in that show, it's because somebody made a choice to include it. And you can also make a choice not to include those things.
And talking about that show, because I wanted to bring it up at some point, even though it's only very tangentially and as not at all related to D&D. But one of the things I have actually enjoyed, and I wanted to get your opinion on this, and I'm not going to talk about Black Elves or anything, because that's not the thing that has impressed me the most. Two things have impressed me. One thing in a positive way, one thing in a very negative way. For those of you people who still haven't watched it, I'm sorry, I'm going to do two little tiny spoilers. One is a genocidal Galadriel, which is a bit like, okay, you're kind of scaring me now. Stay away from me. And the other thing is, though, there is, to me, an absolutely magical scene when she captures this Uruk and he gives this impassionately beautiful speech as to about we just want to be alive. We just want to be here and not be bothered either. And it's a bit. I think this is the first time ever that I have seen anyone breaking with this orcish bioessentialism in Lord of the Rings lore and Middle Earth. And if anything has been brave to do, I think that was one of the bravest things that they have done in the whole of the show, regardless of representation and everything, which is a different, completely kettle of fish. But this one, I just thought, damn, I was almost feeling empathic about that character. I liked him.
Well, he also says something about your other point, which is, I guess I'm not the only elf here touched by darkness. To Galadriel.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
I agree.
I thought that was absolutely amazing. And I guess to go back into, all this of savage orc and that sort of thing, it strips away. I think it's a matter of, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm talking about from the ignorant point of view here. I think it's a matter of disassociating, if you're a sentient species, you cannot be stereotyped. Full stop. If you're an orc, you cannot be savagified suddenly just because. Would that work for all the species? Though in D&D is a game where you need villains. How would you do it, for instance, for leeches or beholders or vampires? How do you work with that to break that bioessentialism?
I'll speak to that. So two things. One, I generally, when it comes to decisions about how do we handle this in a way that's appropriate and respectful and sensitive, anytime a question like that comes up, I'm always a fan of checking with the people that are affected, right? So, for example, when I read whatever a variety of different people in the fantasy world and in D&D of color reporting that how essentialist attitudes about orcs bother them, I would want to check in with them too. I'd be like, well, how do you feel about fiends and celestials, right? I mean, like, is it okay for them to be born bad, right? Or whatever. And my understanding is most people who are made uncomfortable, like, I don't feel like there's a place for me in D&D because of the way orcs are depicted. They don't normally have a problem with demons being bad things or people, right? So you might limit the no bioessentialist stereotyping of unpleasant traits to humanoids or material plane creatures or something. That's one way to do it. To say, look, beholders are just going to do the beholder thing. And you might, include in the lore and the guidance, well, there are some good beholders, but they're just typically nasty or weird or whatever. Same thing with demons or devils or celestials, right? I mean, Zariel is a fallen celestial. That happens, right? Even in the lore. So, I mean, that's one solution, is just saying, like, look, the thing we're talking about is humanoids, because that's what most reflects the real world, is humanoids. So elves and orcs and, blah, blah, blah. And those are the ones we play, right? You typically, that would be my primary solution. And my secondary one would be, if you are going to attribute essentialist traits to any creature, make sure they're not ones that are reflective of real world prejudices and stereotypes, right? Referring to the people that are primitive as savages, and I'm putting those in scare quotes because they're problematic terms, that's just like 19th century colonialism, right?
Yeah.
Now, but referring to the bird people as having wings and the tritons as having gills, that does not reflect a real world prejudice. So it's not as problematic to attribute those as essentialist characteristics. So just keep that in mind when you're doing demons, right? I have definitely seen some depictions of devils that lean into they're like the Nazis kind of thing or something, and that's like, sometimes that's a little, I think that it's a little dangerous, right?
Okay.
From a design perspective,
Okay.
can be a little too close to real world.
Mhm.
I myself prefer they're like the ultimate bureaucrats, right? If I'm gonna like stereotype, that's more fun. So yeah, trying to avoid just in general the ones that are problematic, even when you're ascribing them to liches or something, is the how I do it myself. I don't know how
Chris,
you feel, Chris.
how are you?
I'm going to come at it from a different angle, and that is that. So I've heard this argument before that, oh, you need villains, and you don't. And I'm just going to come right out and say you don't need your sapient humanoid species to be an entire sapient humanoid species to be villains. You don't.
True.
And so you don't need an entire species of orcs or bugbears or hobgoblins or anything like that to be universally evil.
Agree.
And any more than you need all humans in your setting to be evil. And you can have all kinds of hobgoblin villains, all kinds of orc villains, orc raiders, orc bandits, the same way you can have human bandits and elven raiders and whatever. So you don't need to have a species that's just bad, a sapient species that's just bad. And it's also kind of boring, if you ask me. I mean, for you to be able to count on that, for you to be able to, I see an orc, I can just kill the orc because, and that's actually going against some things that were said by the original creators of D&D. What I just said, like Gygax wanted there to be a clear. You see an orc, you know it's evil.
Yeah, he said worse than that.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
And I don't think that that's essential at all. You will never run short of villains, and they don't need to have gray skin and tusks, either. So
So I wonder if as I'm thinking as I am listening to you two, and I wonder if this formula, how you think it would work to differentiate and separate what you are, an orc, what you can become given the circumstances, and make that the true differentiator between why an orc is evil or why a leech can become neutral. Let's say that a leech, because of the procedure that they have to go through in order to become a leech, can never be good because it's just too tainted. It had to do too many sacrifices. It had to give away too much of themselves.
Although to put a foil in that right away, there are Baelnorns in Forgotten Realms that are good. So
good elves
okay.
are good elven liches.
Good elven liches. So
okay, but are they liches? I don't know about the existence. So
I mean, they're not liches in the sense of the stereotypical lich, but
unlike liches have to consume souls,
right,
to maintain their existence. So I do think that, and it's their choosing to become a lich, right? So it's a little different than a racial stereotype or a racial trait, right? So vampires, liches, there are some, ghouls, there are some creatures that their existence depends on the mind flayers, the suffering of other sentient creatures. So it's pretty easy to interpret them as mostly not good, right? But no, I mean, Chris is exactly right. I mean, instead of it just being literally a civilization of orcs nearby that's the threat, how dare they set up villages with their children? How about it be people chose to do evil? That's more compelling. That's one of the things that's been really interesting to me that I didn't expect really, but as I'm delighted to see is trying to address this problem, like a mechanical problem, a way a mechanic of the game is distasteful, actually has this huge narrative payoff because it's so much more interesting to have like characters that break those tropes and stereotypes. I mean, who and it's really good storytelling. Like you get your Carrot Iron Founderson type characters, right? The human raised by dwarves in Terry Pratchett's novels, and that interesting phenomenon. Like these are people choosing evil, not being born into it. Being born into it is boring. It's it's two-dimensional. It's overly simplistic, right?
Yeah,
And to add another dimension to it, even the invading orc army doesn't have to be evil. An invading an invading army doesn't have to be evil. People fought over things throughout human history. And
Yeah.
could you point at a side and where you couldn't point at either side and say those were the good guys and those were the bad guys?
And
Like,
even if one of them is in the wrong, it's the people making it's the generals, not the foot soldiers.
right, exactly.
that's why I was wondering, about differentiating that, what you become and why. It doesn't have to be who you are, but it is what you have become. And I think separating those two, it can probably give us a very good foothold as to how to start creating a new species, or modifying the species as they have been presented until now. I can imagine, not thinking aloud and being stupid, a leech that decides that they don't want to consume the souls of innocent people, and they're only going to consume the soul of people who've done evil things, because that way they can help make up for the evil that they have themselves done in the past.
Dexter as a leech.
Yes, exactly. something like that. So I wonder, and I do think I agree with the richness of having orcs that are caught in the way in the middle of a conflict. What if this orc, as you said, the generals told him to go and invade this crop because they are dying of starvation. Maybe they don't want to do it.
See, and that makes an interesting story, because if you're on an adventure where you go and the core concept is, oh, there's an army of orcs, but you come into a scout camp and you find out that these orcs are starving, they don't want to be there, they surrender immediately, then that changes the dynamic of the story. Exactly. It's way more interesting than just, oh, we're going to go fight a bunch of orcs.
I suggested, and I want to say it out loud in here, because I want people to hear from me. So if Wizards of the Coast does this, my idea, thank you very much, boom. At least for the next edition, I would absolutely love to see Orcus has decided that it's going to try and command all the orcs and all the evil species in all the worlds that he can get his hands on, and say, no, let's kill everything else. And to see that conflict among those species, orcs saying, no way, dude. You've lost it. We've got nothing to do with you. And then a few more orcs saying, yeah, that sounds like fun. Let's go for it, dude. Let's kill all this shit. And then other orcs saying, I don't want to do it, but my boss does. So this is a conflict. And building the whole universe based around that mega baddie who's just lost the plot and think, I'm just bored. I just want to do this because I'm bored. And all these species that used to be completely monolithically evil, just saying, no. Not all of us, I'm sorry. No. We want to stay, a little bit more alive than we are now. Thank you very much, because dying and going to the abyss with you, kind of not fun. Let's not do it. So I think something like that could be, suddenly everything is a lot richer and more interesting just by that.
I mean, I think that Wizards might have something like that in mind with the Drow, because they've hinted that, I need to go back and look at the most recent book or two, but I saw them hint somewhere that they're going to describe that in the new, I know what it is. It's in the monster entry that's been updated, refers to the Drow as having a culture. One of the Drow cultures is this Menzoberranzan Loth worshipping evil, and the implication is that there's other Drow cultures that aren't that way, right? That these are the people either born into who are choosing the Loth cult, right, and making it a cultural phenomenon, not a biological one.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that would be great if they started doing that and introducing more. That's another thing. I mean, yes, we want to remove the essentialism of biology, but it would also be nice if we didn't essentialize the culture much either, right? Like, everyone who lives here is this way is problematic too, not quite as immediately upsetting as everyone born of this parentage is race is a savage. But everyone who lives in that country is smart is also kind of weird too.
Yeah.
Mm.
So maybe depicting like this is what's happening. Like if I were creating Menzo Berenzan for wizards,
Mhm.
I'd say yes, there's a love cult, but there's also an underground
Yeah.
that's trying to overturn it or something. You know what I mean? Like show that they're dynamic and diverse people, just like we would
And the
expect
majority of the
humans to be.
population is just kind of caught in the middle, like
Yeah,
just trying
there's
to live their
oppressed.
life. They're
Yeah.
trying to live their life, and they're oppressed by this evil that's at the top.
Hmm.
So that's the thing. Like you can take villainy,
Mhm.
and put it in a place, even at the top of a hierarchy. That doesn't mean that it filters to the bottom, right? Doesn't mean that it filters through all the levels of that society. In fact, it probably doesn't, because most sapient species don't want to be oppressed. They don't want to have to conform to, uh, well, let's take Lolth, demonic theocracy, right?
Mhm.
A demonic blood sacrifice theocracy. No, I don't think that most of the people, but the thing is that the average person in that society is just like the average person in the other side of society on earth that's been oppressed. And that is, what are they going to, they feel like, what can I do about it? I'm just, if I try to rise up, I'm just going to get killed, and my family's going to get killed. And so they just endure it. Whereas you also have that, what Gwen was just talking about, that rebellious underground that's full of people who are trying to tear down the oppression. And that's a more interesting story.
Do people want, and I'm saying this for a reason that it will become clear, but do people want interesting stories? Because I get the feeling that one of the reasons that people are very keen of sticking to this bioessentialism and sticking to this monolithic cultural phenomenon of Menzo Berenzon style cities is because, aside from bigotry, I'm leaving bigots aside, um, it's easier. I mean, it's a lot easier if you can just say, oh, these things, cops are always going to be white, and also orcs are always going to be evil, or goblins are always going to be stupid. It makes it a lot easier to do it that way. How would you two simplify as much as possible the creation of that nuance, so people who feel daunted, who feel like, oh, I don't want to have to deal with this effort, don't see that as an obstacle?
Well, I would say that, uh, just describe sapient species as people. First of all, we all understand what people are. So I think every player or every dungeon master understands what a person is. And if you describe goblins as people
Mhm.
first, then sure, there are stupid goblins, and there are goblins that will rob you when you're traveling through the woods, because that's what they are doing. And, and I think that from a game design perspective and from making D&D perspective, we as game designers owe people the tools that allow them to make as rich a story as they want to. You can always ignore it, but as somebody who's producing it, that's kind of your job. It's kind of your job to give the most interesting and broad base of tools you can.
Yeah, that's right. And do it. I mean, and mechanic very simply, you can do things like do away with racial alignment. It's not hard.
Yeah.
And B, when you're writing your adventures, have the bad guys be a criminal organization that or a cult that people voluntarily join. It's or something, right? Then okay, fine. You just know everyone in those cult robes are bad, and you can go fight them, right? And you don't have to be a racist to do it. And that's like not hard to do from a storytelling perspective. And you can just simplify. I think, a lot of people do want their D&D to be like a war game still. And it's like, well, those are the baddies and we're the goodies and the goodies shoot the baddies. And there we go. It's that simple. They don't want to think about nuance and the real world and stuff like that. But for those of us who like narrative too and don't want to alienate players of color, for example, or anybody who's upset by racism, we do care about it. And you're right, as Chris said, if we're designing the game, we have an obligation to, because to fail to take all that into account is to not do your job right.
But to flip that on its head a little bit, I think that when people say that they don't want to have to think about it, you can have these tools and the official design saying what we're talking about with the broad breadth of acknowledging that these beings are people.
Mm.
And it doesn't prevent anybody from having a cave full of goblin bandits. That you can just, you don't have to, there's no moral quandary, right? They've been threatening the town. They've been killing things. They've been robbing people on the road. Have to put a stop to it. I think that characterizing them as people, though, opens the door for more role-playing opportunities and things like that. Like, people, when they're threatened by a superior force, they surrender or they run away. You know, they don't just stand there and allow themselves to be killed or whatever. So, I mean, yeah, I guess I'm just repeating that we create a broad breadth of tools, and you can select the villainy that you want from that gamut, right?
Yeah, and you're right. Presenting a gamut is important too. I'm a huge fan of going against type when I'm creating like NPCs, you know, like the dapper orc and the, you know what I mean? Like that's fun, right?
It's fun,
and by having in your art and in your character like lore and narrative and character design examples of how this is a smart goblin. Yeah, they exist. See, right? It doesn't, you know, and you can still say everything that we've said. And just by showing that periodically, you know, you can encounter savvy, charming orcs and smart goblins, they're out there. It just like signals to the reader that they can do that too, right? With their creations if they want.
Well, you know, you must be able to find charming orcs and charming goblins, because otherwise, how are you going to get a new species? You know, I would love to be able to fall in love with an orc. Or, you know, see a human and a goblin being able to have a family. I think I would love to see that.
Circling back around to something we said earlier, my wife is in love with an orc.
And something that I was talking about, my little thingy earlier, in Ancestry and Culture, I do have rules for like mixed ancestry, and I don't care for what Wizards is doing in 1D&D on the mixed ancestry front. I think that's a failure. But I definitely am a fan of one idea that's present in that, and that's in mine too, which is it's not just humans that are sleeping with non-humans, right? It's like human and elf, human and orc. You know, why not elf and orc, right? And also the half language is problematic. Right? It's just of mixed ancestry, right? It's not about being 50% or some drop of blood quantum thing. You don't know. We don't want that in our fantasy because that's gross. But it's so much fun. Like, I mean, I was talking about the narrative. It's like choosing your race or your ancestry and then your culture. You're like, I want to be an elf raised by dwarves. All of a sudden, you're like, there's more story potential there than just an elf. Or I'm a dwarf. You're like, well, oh, that's interesting. What happened? Or I have an elf parent and an orc parent, and I was raised by halflings. And you're like, whoa, there's a story there, right? So just or like, this is an army that's mostly orcs, but they're fighting for a good cause, or they're being forced to fight against their will. Like, just by messing with those tropes, you just invite so much more story.
And I think it works a lot better. I mean, and gives you a lot more chances of surprise. I remember one of my last D&D character I played with my former group was a halfling who had a fling. They had a thing for dragonborns and had a baby. You know, they laid an egg after becoming pregnant with a dragonborn, and they were going out there, you know, gallivanting around the world, adventuring, because they divorced and they had to send as much gold and money to look after the child. Anthony. The child was called Anthony, by the way. So yeah, well, I choose the weirdest names for my characters and my NPCs, and that's the way they were doing. So when I said to my friends, you know, but wait a second, you're wearing an armor and you're a halfling. Well, yeah, I'm a halfling ranger, and I had a child with a dragonborn, and I have a thing for draconids. I just love them. Get over it. And all my friends would be like, oh, okay. Do we want to know how you laid your eggs? And just think about it. Just imagine it. Okay. And that it's probably one of the most memorable characters I have ever had. It just works so well.
I had so many people on message boards and stuff complaining that like, well, it's not biologically possible because of the difference. And I'm like, we're in a world where there are dragons that shoot fire out of their mouth. That's also biologically possible. Why is it weird that an orc and an elf or a halfling and a dragonborn could have a baby?
And love each other, most importantly. Yeah. Why can't they love each other?
I just want to interject with something to quote a friend of mine, Stephen Radley McFarland. You realize we make this shit up, right? Like, we make it all up. We just made it all up. Like,
I had people like quoting like biological law and taxonomy and cladistics to me, and I'm like, that this is pretend, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, according to Google, we have 10 minutes before this call finishes. Thank you, Google. So I want to go into it's annoying. I want to go into one particular topic regarding culture creation, which is very hot and probably could deserve its own topic. But when we build cultures, regardless of whether they are monolithic or not, let's assume they are not monolithic, but there is a country. And this is a topic that I would like to go into because I know a lot of people want it. Personally, I don't know enough about it. And I think it needs to be tackled head on at some point, even more often, which is the topic of slavery. It's a big one, but how would you two approach it if you wanted, for whatever reason, that made it hypothetically necessary, which I know is impossible, it's never necessary, but let's assume it is. How would you tackle the topic of slavery when you're world building and creating a culture?
Want to go first, Chris, or shall
I want you to go first, actually.
Okay. So I'll give you two answers: the short one and the slightly less short one. The short one is I wouldn't.
Okay.
I don't put slavery in my game. I don't put sexual assault in my games. Things that someone reading along might get, like an unsuspecting reader might be upset by or put off by. I just don't put that content in my games. Now, if for some reason somebody said hypothetically, okay, like here's an example: if I were creating it for my home game, right? Because if I know the players and I know what they're, what they prefer or something, just for example,
okay,
I would. Oh, go ahead.
Just wanting to say one thing to make an example that people will identify with. Let's say that they want to do the next edition of Dark Sun, which is a setting that has very heavily relied on slavery. And how would you go about that?
I mean, I wouldn't. I would say they should not remake Dark Sun. They just need to give it up or reboot it without slavery, is what I would say. But if you have to have, even not as a culture, just an example, like there are some slavers, they're the bad guys. So like there's the possibility that you will encounter slaves. Which again I wouldn't do, but if I had to, you have to give agency to the people that are being enslaved or imprisoned, and represent them as people, and make it absolutely unambiguous that the slavery and the slavers are evil and wrong. Because a lot of the times, first of all, you never want to be, well, it's another culture, and in their culture, it's okay. No, it isn't. It isn't okay in any culture or any sentient group of people. Should never do that, and I don't care if they're orcs or elves or what. So make it clear that they're in the wrong, and then make it clear that the slaves are still people, right? Because you don't want to dehumanize or
objectify, yes,
objectify, and rob them of any ability to be fully realized people. They should be, and honestly, if I'm writing if I'm writing narrative, they will be free. They will free themselves at some point. Right. So that you also don't want to have like, it's our job to come in and free the slaves. We're the white saviors here.
Yeah.
That's not great either. But again, I just would avoid it myself.
Chris, how about you?
I feel the same way. I wouldn't include it in something that I was making whole cloth, for example. Um, uh, I am okay with also lots of villainy as long as the players, like Gwen said, are comfortable with certain types of villainy. I'm okay with these bad guys have imprisoned people and they are forcing them to say work in the mine or something like that. But that's different than cultural slavery. Would I have a culture that's like the Romans were?
Mhm.
No. Would I have a culture that's like the American South was before the Civil War? No. No, I wouldn't. And Dark Sun does characterize slavery as villainy,
Mhm.
but still, the one of the problems with it is that in Dark Sun is that despite the fact that it's characterized as villainy, it's still a cultural norm, and that's the issue. So, across the Dark Sun city states, slavery is a cultural norm. So, if you're walking through a city in Dark Sun, you're going to see the slave trading thing,
Mhm.
the slave trading place, and you're not going to do anything about it because it's been presented as a cultural norm. And that's the issue. And that's one of the things that's going to be really difficult to do right in a new version of Dark Sun, even though it's characterized as villainy.
In fact, you could even be a player character and buy a slave if you wanted to, because they are there to be purchased, which is
Yeah.
I just think the concept is absolutely horrific.
I will say this does bring up the complicated topic of the fact that mind flayers exist.
Mhm.
And I mean, that's basically what their literal metaphysical existence. They cannot make more mind flayers without doing something even worse in a way than slavery. Right?
Mm.
They take other sentient species and infect them and turn them into thralls. And that's problematic. And in fact, the lore of like half the darn sentient races in Forgotten Realms and they used to be slaves of the mind flayers. You know, the Gith, the Duergar, the Darrow. I mean, there's a lot of them, and I mean, great, they freed themselves, but that was what was wrong with the Hadozi
Mm-hmm.
in the most recent Spelljammer book.
Yeah.
Which somehow they really dropped the ball on that one, and it's problematic as hell. As heck, I don't know what the standards are here.
We're three adults talking.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
We don't have standards.
But you know, I mean, it's problematic. Like somebody once asked me, well, would you not have mind flayers in your game because they are slavers? I'm like, I don't know. I'd have to think hard about how to do something like that. I might consider not.
Mhm.
I'd have to figure out how. That's I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. Do you, Chris? Do you have an answer for that one? I don't.
Well, I would treat the way what mind flayers do as more transformative and more the person that that they have used to create a new mind flayer is just gone. Right?
Yeah.
It's just raw material. It's not slavery. It's just raw material. And it's villainy, of course, because you're murdering other sapients to but it's also a really strange story. Like they are just reproducing their own kind. Is that evil? Well, yeah, because they're murdering people. I mean, so I don't know. And I would probably present them as something um, like the true mind flayer is actually just a psychic entity, and it's more like spreading the psychic energy spreading its tendrils out, and you kind of want to trim those tendrils back and kind of force it back into its own dimension. Like this is not your place.
Like an invasive species of
Yeah.
weed in your garden or something.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that there are ways to do it that are less problematic, but it requires, just like anything in making something great, it requires conscious effort and thinking about what it is you're creating and doing.
True. And with that, I think we can start saying our farewells before very rudely Google decides to cut us off. Gwen, thank you very, very much indeed for being here. This has been absolutely fantastic, and I hope we can do it again.
Yeah, this is wonderful. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure entirely. And Chris, I'll talk to you very soon in WhatsApp. Boom.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, both of you.
Yeah, thank you, Gwen.
All right, thanks. Well, have a good rest of your evening.